At 7:15 a.m. on February 12, 1944, Technical Sergeant Sam Riley, an armored maintenance specialist with the U.S. 1st Armored Division, was pinned inside the smoking turret of an M4A1 Sherman tank, 4 miles inland from the Anzio beachhead. The air inside the hull was thick, metallic, and screaming hot, filled with the noxious fumes of burnt gunpowder and atomized fuel. Just seconds earlier, an 88mm high-velocity shell, fired from a hidden German position on the Alban Hills, had ripped clean through the Sherman's right-hand sponson, just above the tracks. The initial explosion had killed the tank commander instantly, vaporizing the back of his head and showering the interior with fragments of bone and hot steel. The shot hadn't detonated the ammunition rack, but the sheer kinetic energy of the impact, combined with superheated spall flying off the interior wall, had turned the tank into a metal blender. Riley, who had been riding outside on the fender but had jumped inside to assist with a jammed radio moments before, was now desperately pulling the scorched driver, Corporal Mendez, out through the loader's hatch. Mendez wasn't dead, but his face was an unrecognizable pulp of burns and bleeding metal slivers. The Sherman was crippled, a derelict monument to American optimism facing German reality. Riley shoved Mendez onto the slick, muddy earth outside, ignoring the distant, rhythmic thump-thump of incoming mortar fire. He stood there for only 3 seconds, staring at the perfectly punched hole in the tank's side, a hole the size of a fist. He wasn't a tanker by trade. He was a fixer, a man who saw combat as a series of engineering failures. And this specific failure, the 38mm of rolled homogeneous steel on the side of the M4A1, was happening constantly, turning the Anzio operation into a slow-motion catastrophe for American armor. The Anzio landing, Operation Shingle, was supposed to be a strategic dagger aimed at Rome, bypassing the formidable German Gustav line. Instead, by mid-February, the Allied forces were trapped in a constricted, frozen perimeter barely 7 miles deep. Field Marshal Kesselring, commander of the German forces, had choked the perimeter with the ring of steel, massed artillery, Nebelwerfers, and crucially, dozens of concealed anti-tank strongpoints armed with a devastating 88mm flak gun and a PaK-40 anti-tank cannons. The terrain around the beachhead was unforgiving. Flat, waterlogged reclaimed marshland giving way to low, critical ridges, all overlooked by the steep slopes of the Alban Hills. This meant every American tank movement was visible, and every American tank was a target. The German tankers and anti-tank crews knew the weaknesses of the M4 Sherman intimately: the sides, the lower hull, and the transmission housing. TSGT, Riley had seen 3 Shermans gutted in the last 48 hours alone. He was 26 years old, a former diesel mechanic from Newark, New Jersey, and a man whose patience for Army regulations had evaporated somewhere around North Africa. To the regular brass, Riley was a headache unruly, quick-to-challenge procedure, and obsessed with hoarding junk. "He runs a scrapyard, not a motor pool," Major Harding had grumbled 3 days prior. But Riley's obsession wasn't hoarding. It was applied paranoia. He had noticed patterns. German AP rounds, even the formidable ones, frequently defeated the M4's standard side armor, but they struggled against layered resistance. They might penetrate the initial plate, but the projectile would often break up or destabilize if it encountered a second air gap and another sheet of steel immediately afterward. The Army doctrine stipulated that adding non-standard steel to the tanks was strictly forbidden. The official argument was weight distribution, crew safety, and maintaining the vehicle's structural integrity. The unofficial truth was that the brass preferred keeping vehicles stock standard for logistics and replacement, even if it cost lives. Riley, watching the medic load Corporal Mendez into a jeep bound for the casualty clearing station, made a silent decision that morning. He knew the maintenance teams were supposed to pull the crippled M4A1 back to the rear area for a full overhaul. But the Germans were due to launch a major counterattack, Operation Fishfang, Operation Fishing Catch, within the next 72 hours, designed specifically to collapse the beachhead. Every operational tank mattered. Riley walked back toward the smoking Sherman, ignoring the shouting voices of a nearby platoon leader ordering him to move. He carried a heavy-duty acetylene torch and a small, greasy rucksack. Inside the rucksack were blueprints, drawn hastily on the back of requisition forms designs for something the motor. Pool crews had started calling the Scrapsmith's defense. It was an audacious, dangerous plan born of desperation and the specific geometry of German ordnance. Riley planned to turn the regulations on their head. He wouldn't wait for permission or official parts. He was going to salvage every piece of discarded metal he could find, shattered tank tracks, steel plating from destroyed trucks, and even the thick reinforced covers from drainage pipes, and weld it directly onto the vulnerable side skirts of 3 remaining Shermans in his immediate company. He was gambling that improvised, layered armor, built from scrap metal and sheer engineering will, could save his men from the looming German steel storm. If he was caught, it would be court-martial. If his modification failed, his crew would die. But if it worked, he would rewrite the rules of survival on the Anzio beachhead. At 10:15 a.m., Riley and 2 of his most trusted, equally rebellious mechanics began their clandestine work, 300 yards from the nearest enemy mortar position, armed only with welding masks and the conviction that scrap could defeat the 88. By 1:30 p.m. that same day, February 12th, TSGT Riley's maintenance depot resembled a chaotic blacksmith shop fueled by desperation. The air vibrated with the crackle of arc welding and the ringing clang of steel hammers. They were working on the M4A3 Sherman Valkyrie, commanded by Lieutenant Dale Stevens, one of the 3 tanks selected for Riley's unofficial modification. The modification, which Riley had nicknamed the Scrapsmith's Defense, was an exercise in ballistic improvisation. Riley knew that the 88mm armor-piercing rounds, AP, relied on kinetic energy and mass to punch straight through the relatively thin 38mm side armor of the Sherman. To defeat it, he needed to either deflect the shot or make it waste energy before reaching the primary hull. His solution was layered, spaced armor built entirely from debris. Riley and his 2 mechanics, Specialist First Class Kowalski and Private Diaz, were primarily using salvaged track links from destroyed M3 light tanks. These links, heavy and made of manganese steel, were labor-intensive to handle, but offered a resilient surface. First, they welded angle iron frames, salvaged from the undercarriage of a wrecked supply truck, directly onto the side sponsons of the Sherman, creating a 4-inch gap between the hull and the new external layer. This gap was crucial. It introduced standoff distance. If an AP shell hit the outer plate, the 4-inch air gap would ideally allow the already destabilized projectile to pitch sideways or fracture before it struck the main hull. Next, they fitted the track links onto these frames, overlapping them slightly like heavy scaled tiles. Below the tracks, where the hull was equally vulnerable, they cut and shaped thick, rounded steel plates taken from demolished Italian water pipes. The density was inconsistent, but it was better than nothing. The entire side of the Valkyrie, from the turret ring down to the track skirt, was now shielded by an ugly, uneven patchwork of scrap metal. The sheer mass of the added material was immense. Riley estimated they had added close to 4,000 pounds of steel to the tank, primarily distributed along the sides. At 3:45 p.m., the operation drew the wrong kind of attention. Major Harding, the division's executive officer, arrived, his uniform pristine despite the mud. He stopped 10 feet from Valkyrie, shielded his eyes from the welding flash, and stared at the Frankenstein monster of a tank. "Sergeant Riley, what in God's name is that?" Harding's voice was sharp enough to cut through the welding noise. Riley, pulling up his mask, pointed the torch away. "Major, this is an immediate, field-expedient armor upgrade. We took 3 hits on the 41st and 42nd yesterday. all through the sides. "We're running out of viable tanks, sir. You are violating General Order 17, Section C. You are dangerously altering the vehicle's center of gravity and suspension tolerances. This is unacceptable, unauthorized modification, Sergeant. You are to strip that junk off the tank immediately." This was the central dilemma. Official mandate versus survival engineering. Riley knew he had about 48 hours until Operation Fishfang hit. Stripping the armor meant guaranteed loss of the tank and potentially the crew in the coming engagement. "Sir," Riley pressed, lowering his voice, "the crew of this tank, Lieutenant Stevens and his 3 men, they know the modifications are here. They are volunteering to test it. They believe in this. If we strip it off, they are rolling out tomorrow morning with the same 38 millimeters that killed 3 men this morning." Riley didn't wait for the Major's full response. He pivoted slightly, gesturing toward a pile of newly cut steel. He made the tactical choice to force the Major's hand by focusing on the human cost. "Major," Riley continued, his tone shifting from defensive to authoritative, "I understand doctrine, but the enemy doesn't read our manuals. We are in a perimeter where every anti-tank crew has the drop on us. This patch job, while ugly, is designed specifically to defeat the standard penetration power of the 7.5 centimeters Pac 40. We finish the remaining 2 tanks by midnight. If they survive the counterattack, we'll talk about court-martial then." Major Harding was trapped. He couldn't risk ordering the modification removed only for the tank to be destroyed hours later, making him directly responsible for the loss of the crew. He knew the risk was immense, but the imminent threat was greater. Harding simply shook his head, looking disgusted. "I want a full damage report on every round that impacts these monstrosities, Sergeant. Do you understand? Every round. You have until 040 hours. After that, your team is on standby." Harding turned and walked away, his silence a temporary, grudging approval. Riley immediately turned back to the work. The clock was ticking down to the moment of truth. They finished the first tank, Valkyrie, just as the sun dipped below the Alban Hills, casting long, menacing shadows across the perimeter. They had 2 more to go, Hellion and Juggernaut. The scrap was ugly, heavy, and completely against regulation, but for the crews of these 3 Shermans, it was the only thing standing between them and the crushing weight of the German counterattack scheduled for dawn on the 14th. The German counteroffensive, Operation Fishfang, began precisely at 6:45 am on February 14, 1944. It was heralded by a terrifying, coordinated artillery barrage focused entirely on the American perimeter's eastern flank, aimed at cracking the line near the main road to Cisterna. The deep boom of the heavy guns was immediately followed by the high-pitched, screaming wail of the Nebelwerfers, the screaming Mimi, as multi-barreled rockets saturated the Allied positions. Riley, Kowalski, and Diaz were crouched in a shallow trench near the forward motor pool, 500 yards behind the frontline infantry. The 3 modified Sherman's Valkyrie, Hellion, and Juggernaut were already deployed, moving into the critical defensive positions near the factory, a key objective for the German assault. The objective of the German attack was clear: overwhelm the Americans, push them back to the sea, and eliminate the beachhead. The German assault wave included infantry from the elite 26th Panzer Division, supported by heavy armor, including several Panzer IV AUSF H and the lethal, long-barreled Sturmgeschütz III, Stug 3 assault guns. At 7:05 a.m., the ground assault began. Riley received the first radio report from Lieutenant Stevens in Valkyrie. Static was heavy, but the urgency was palpable. "This is Valkyrie. Contact. Front left, 3 Stugs breaking cover. We're engaging at 800 yards. The M4 Sherman's 75 mm main gun was adequate, but often struggled against the thicker frontal armor of the Panzer IVs and Stugs at long range. The real danger lay in the flanking maneuvers, where the German anti-tank teams excelled. The fighting escalated into a brutal, close-quarters slugfest between the infantry and the German armor. By 8:15 a.m., the American line was bent, but not yet broken. The three modified Shermans, ugly and bulky with their scrap armor, were maneuvering to cover a critical crossroads. Then, the first specific engagement involving Riley's modifications occurred. Juggernaut, commanded by Sergeant First Class Miller, was advancing slowly across an open, muddy field, providing fire support for a pinned infantry platoon. A concealed Stug 3, using the wreckage of a burned-out transport truck for cover, shifted its traverse and fired a high-explosive round at the infantry. Miller, spotting the flash, swung his turret. Before Miller could fire, a second Stug 3, positioned on the flank, acquired Juggernaut as a target. At 8:23 a.m., a 75 mm armor-piercing round, AP, from the Stug 3 struck the side of Juggernaut with tremendous force. The target was exactly where Riley had focused his efforts, the center-left sponson just below the driver's viewport. Over the radio, Riley heard Miller's immediate, ragged exhalation. "We're hit! We're hit! God Almighty!" The noise inside a tank hit by a high-velocity AP round is catastrophic, a deafening, screeching crash of metal being destroyed. But critically, Miller immediately followed up with, "Wait, no penetration. We took a heavy impact, but no penetration. Small minimal. The track links saved us." Riley gripped the radio handset so tightly, his knuckles turned white. The scrapsmith's defense had held. What happened inside the tank was a textbook case for spaced armor. The Stug IIP round struck the heavy, overlapping track links and thick steel plate Riley had salvaged. The initial impact fractured the outer layer of steel, and the track links shattered and flew off, but they absorbed significant energy. The round, already yawing and destabilized, then encountered the 4-inch air gap. The remaining kinetic energy was not enough to punch through the main 38 mm hull plate. The crew felt the impact, a violent shockwave, but the round had effectively been stopped, its remnants merely scoring the primary armor. The sheer shock of seeing their own high-velocity round fail to penetrate a Sherman momentarily stunned the German Stug crew. That hesitation was fatal. Sergeant Miller, recovering instantly, swung the 75 mm gun of Juggernaut and fired. The high-explosive round hit the side turret structure of the Stug, failing to penetrate the frontal armor, but blinding the German gunner with smoke and shrapnel. A second round, AP this time, struck the Stug's track, immobilizing it. The German crew, now stuck and under fire from accompanying American infantry, bailed out. The unexpected success immediately bolstered the morale of the three crews. If the German 75 mm AP couldn't kill them from the side, they had a fighting chance. But the Germans were adapting. They had realized that these specific Shermans were different. At 9:15 a.m., Valkyrie faced a direct engagement with a Panzer IV USFH at close range, approximately 100 yards. The German tank focused its fire, aiming precisely at the modified side armor. The first shot hit high on the hull, again failing to penetrate the scrap layers, merely bending them violently inward. But the second shot a minute later was perfectly placed and far more powerful. An 88 mm shell from a stationary anti-tank strongpoint, firing from a position 200 yards away on the ridge, aiming for the engine deck above the scrap armor. The 88 mm round screened toward Valkyrie, promising instant destruction. Did Riley's ingenious, yet non-regulation, gamble save Lieutenant Stevens and his crew from annihilation? Or had the weight and instability of the scrap armor doomed them to a catastrophic failure against the most feared anti-tank gun of the war? Want to know if Valkyrie survived what came next? Hit that like button right now. It tells the algorithm this story matters and helps more people discover it. Subscribe for more untold World War II stories. Back to Valkyrie and the fight for Anzio. The 88 mm shell impacted Valkyrie at 9:18 a.m. The roar was louder, sharper, and far more definitive than the 75mm hits experienced by Juggernaut. The shell did not strike the improvisational side armor directly. Instead, it hit the engine deck's left flank, where the protection was only 19mm thick. But TSGT, Riley's obsession with scrap metal, had led him to an unusual, often overlooked, engineering tactic. Knowing the limitations of the Sherman's rear and top armor, he had also welded several thin discarded steel plates onto the air intakes and the engine deck's vulnerable periphery. These plates weren't thick enough to stop a direct hit, but they were placed in a way that protected crucial coolant lines and, perhaps more importantly, deflected shrapnel. The 88mm round penetrated the thin outer plate and the engine deck, but the location of the impact, right above the radiator and far from the fuel tanks, meant the internal blast was confined. The primary force of the impact was absorbed by the engine block itself, turning the powerful diesel engine into a massive energy sink. Lieutenant Stevens immediately screamed, "Fire!" into the intercom. Black smoke and white steam billowed out of the engine compartment. The engine was dead, the tank immobilized, but the crew compartment, the fighting compartment, remained structurally intact and, crucially, unpenetrated by major spall. Riley and his team received the panicked reports. Valkyrie was out of the fight, but the crew was alive. Stevens reported the situation concisely. Engine killed, hull intact, minor crew injuries. We're disabled, but holding position. We are stationary cover. This was the core strategic victory of the Scrapsmith's defense. Even on a compromised hit, the crew lived. An immobilized Sherman could still be a fortress, providing fire support with its main gun and machine guns. A penetrated Sherman was a tomb. The battle raged around the immobilized Valkyrie. Over the next 2 hours, while the German advance pressed hard against the American positions, Stevens' crew became a fixed strong point. They expended nearly 60 rounds of high-explosive and armor-piercing ammunition, covering the withdrawal of 2 platoons of American infantry. The 2 other modified Shermans, Hellion and Juggernaut, continued to operate effectively. Their unofficial armor earned them a brutal, close-quarters baptism of fire. At 10:40 a.m., Hellion was moving through a narrow lane between 2 farmhouses when it was ambushed by a hidden Pak 40 anti-tank gun at point-blank range less than 50 yards. The gunner aimed for the transmission housing, the traditional killing zone of the Sherman. The round missed the housing, but struck the front right hull, directly on the section where Riley had welded a heavy, multi-layered scrap sheet intended to reinforce the driver's protective position. The impact noise was deafening, sounding like a colossal hammer hitting an anvil. The result was the clearest demonstration of Riley's survival engineering. The Pak 40's 75mm round shattered the outermost scrap layer, but the second and third layers' thick, uneven boilerplate deflected the projectile's core violently. The round did not penetrate, but the force was so immense that it bent the primary hull armor inward by 2 inches, cracking several internal welds and showering the driver, Private Harris, with fragments of paint and insulation. Harris suffered a severe concussion, but he was alive. The tank remained mobile. Within seconds, the gunner of Hellion located the muzzle flash and obliterated the Pak 40 position with 2 shells. By 1 p.m., the Germans, despite intense pressure, failed to achieve a decisive breakthrough. Operation Fishfang stalled, bogged down by tenacious American defense, heavy mud, and the unexpected resilience of 3 oddly customized M4 Shermans. Riley received the maintenance report on Juggernaut and Hellion that afternoon. Juggernaut had taken 4 high-velocity hits to its scrap armor, 0 penetrations. Hellion had taken 3 hits, including the point-blank Pak 40 strike. 1 crewman concussed, 1 mobility-limiting hit to the front plate, which the scrap had defeated, and 0 penetrations to the fighting compartment. Valkyrie was disabled, but had survived an 88mm strike, saving its entire crew. Riley had saved 3 crews and 3 tanks from catastrophic loss using metal scavenged from scrap piles and sheer ingenuity. However, the cost of improvisation was also evident. The added 4,000 pounds of metal had strained the Sherman's vertical volute spring suspension (VVSS) system severely. All 3 tanks required immediate, intensive mechanical overhaul to replace stressed springs and damaged drive components. Furthermore, the official command was now faced with an undeniable reality. The modifications worked, but they were illegal and logistically complex. Major Harding arrived at Riley's maintenance position, surveyed the battle-scarred Hellion, which was already in the bay for repairs, and simply nodded slowly. "Sergeant Riley," Harding said, his tone mixing disapproval with grudging respect. "You saved 3 crews today. You also destroyed the suspension components on 3M4A3 South. The cost in parts is—" he paused, running a hand across the bent, layered scrap on the tank's side. "Irrelevant compared to the cost in men. But we cannot have 300 tanks looking like that." Riley waited, knowing the immediate aftermath of his gamble was coming. He knew he had proven his engineering point, but the Army was resistant to massive, unauthorized changes. Harding leaned closer. "I am submitting a formal report recommending disciplinary action, Sergeant. However, until that report is processed, you are authorized to continue field expedient modifications on any M4 Sherman returning with specific side sponson damage that requires panel replacement. You will use only track links and certified high-grade scrap steel. And you will document every single step. Is that clear, Sergeant?" Riley understood. He wasn't officially exonerated, but he had been tacitly given the green light to continue his survival engineering. The 3 scrapyard tanks had just rewritten the standard operating procedure for the 1st Armored Division at Anzio. The immediate aftermath of Operation Fishfang solidified Technical Sergeant Sam Riley's reputation. His scrapsmith's defense, initially mocked as a junk pile, was officially, albeit quietly, adopted as the Anzio add-on by forward maintenance units of the U.S. Fifth Army. While it never became standard Army issue, the practice of welding salvaged track links and heavy steel plating onto the vulnerable sides of Shermans spread quickly through the beachhead, often executed unofficially under the principle of necessity in combat. Riley's insight into survival engineering had fundamentally altered the fate of the American armored crews at Anzio. By early March, the average survival rate of M4 Shermans that had received the field modifications improved significantly against the ubiquitous German 75mm anti-tank threats. It was a testament to the soldiers' inherent ability to innovate under duress, rejecting doctrine when doctrine failed to deliver safety. Riley was never formally court-martialed for his initial disobedience. The formal recommendation for disciplinary action was permanently tabled by a general officer who understood that the lives saved far outweighed the bureaucratic transgression. Riley was quietly promoted and transferred to a logistics position, tasked with standardizing the process of salvaging and attaching track links, a process he had invented using sheer audacity and an acetylene torch. The modifications made by Riley and his team, the heavy, uneven patchwork of steel, were a visible sign of the desperation of the Anzio campaign, a visual signature of the desperate ingenuity required to survive the Ring of Steel. The men in the 1st Armored Division knew that when they saw a Sherman covered in that ugly, improvised plating, they were looking at a tank that had been engineered for life, not for the regulations manual. The M4 Shermans continued the fight for months, battling through the mud and under the shadow of the Alvin Hills until the eventual breakout in late May 1944. Riley's contribution, born in the heat of a crisis, was to give the crews the most precious commodity in tank warfare: a fraction of a second more time, a moment of survival that often allowed them to fire back and win the engagement. His story is one of thousands, often overshadowed by grand strategy, but fundamentally crucial to the outcome of the war. These were the men who didn't just follow orders. They fixed problems that the headquarters hadn't even recognized yet, using whatever they could scavenge in the brutal reality of the front line. If this story moved you, don't just click away. Hit like, hit subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and whether anyone in your family served in World War II, especially in the Italian or Mediterranean theater. You are part of the reason these men aren't erased from history. Technical Sergeant Sam Riley and his mechanics paid the price of ingenuity and disobedience to save their comrades. All we're asked to do is remember. Never forget.